I'd like to now introduce our first speaker and our plenarist. It's a great honor to have Professor Dan Melia with us today. He gave us an excellent talk yesterday at our departmental seminars, so we're working him very hard for small amounts of hospitality, but a great amount of gratitude for his efforts on our behalf here in Edinburgh. Professor Melia, as I mentioned, is a professor emeritus at the University of California at Berkeley. He graduated with a PhD from the University of Harvard in Celtic languages and literatures and has been working on a very impressive array of topics over the years. Today he is going to be talking to us. The title of his talk is Sticky Fingers, the Afterlife of Pre-Christian Supernatural Beings in Medieval Celtic Texts. So I'd like to warmly welcome Professor Dan Melia to the podium here, and I'd like you to welcome him as well. Professor Melia.
Thank you. Thank you, Rob, for a warm welcome, and thank all of you for turning out in the morning. When Emily contacted me about this and asked what I was working on, I happened to have been teaching a course involving the Mabinogi, and I said I was thinking about the problem of why the gods hang around in a Christian context so late, and particularly amongst the Celts. And as you'll see, I'm still thinking about it. But I will offer you the thoughts I have had to date. And I'm happy to take any suggestions. Sometimes the gods stick around as mere expressions, by Jove, sometimes frozen into place names, Lyon or Leiden, or Carlisle for that matter, from Lugudunum, fortified place of the god Lug. Sometimes as detached metaphors, Pandora's box. What I've been concerned about lately, though, is the appearance of pre-Christian gods in medieval Celtic narratives, either as recognizable names, Lug MacEthlin, Nuadhu, Mabon Modron, Manawyddan, and there's allegedly a votive head of Mabon, who would be the quintessential son figure, male child figure. Rianna, the Dagda. In particular, what might be called time sliding occurs in at least two branches of the Mabinogi, in which figures from the imagined pre-Christian world mingle either with Christians or with historically Christian settings. In Manawyddan, the tale's eponym interacts with a priest and a bishop in the episode of the enchanted rapacious mice, and in Branwen, Bran instructs his followers to eventually bury his head facing France, and the word is Frank, the traditional enemy, at the Tower of London, implying not only a Christian time frame, but a time not unadjacent to the 100 Years' War, that is, post-1337, about coeval with the White Book, which is the earlier Welsh version of the Mabinogi collection. In our own era, after Tristram Shandy, Surrealism, Dada, Magic Realism, and the like, such slippage would hardly even rise to active notice in the eyes of a Guardian book reviewer. But given the shape of what survives to us of medieval narrative in Celtic languages, the intermixing of Christian and pre-Christian worlds in the Mabinogi narratives is somewhat unusual and deserves comment. Let me start by examining the complex of motifs and references surrounding the character of Rhiannon in the Mabinogi. Why, after 1,000 years of Christianity, does such a character persist in Welsh legendary narrative? In the first branch of the Mabinogi, our initial protagonist, Poole, having earned the title Pen Anufin, chief of the otherworld, by exchanging his kingdom with the supernatural being Araun, seeks a wife, the natural next stage in this story of maturation into sovereignty. And I don't want to get into too many tedious recitations of plot, but of course he's the young sovereign, and he goes hunting, and he sicks his hunting dogs on a stag, and it turns out to be actually the prey of Araun, who is king of the otherworld, and who upbraids him for his rudeness, and he's he's quite sorry about this, and they exchange places, and he goes to the other world, and he manages to kill Aaron's chief adversary, someone named Havgan. We want to get into the world of climate mythology. His name has the word summer in it, and Aaron is in the other world, so who knows? But I don't want to get into the theories about that. But the point is, he's overcome one series of tests about how do you deal with other kings, how do you deal with people of the other world, how do you exhibit bravery, and how do you exhibit chivalry, because he doesn't have sexual relations with Aaron's wife for the whole year. So he's learned a bunch of things. Then he comes back, and the story says one time he was in Arberth, his chief court, and I'm using Pat Ford's translation here, and a feast had been prepared for him, and the great numbers of men with him. After the first sitting, Poole rose to take a walk, and proceeded to the top of a mound that was just above the court, called the Mound of Arberth, which is still there. Lord, said a member of the court, it is a characteristic of the mound that any noble who sits upon it shall not leave it without one of two things. Either he will be wounded or suffer an injury, or he will see a marvel. And of course, this is the famous Arthurian siege perilous. What Poole sees from the mound is a richly dressed woman riding a majestic pale white horse slowly along the main road by the mound. And if you actually go there, you can kind of imagine this. It's still, the scene is still sort of there. Poole sends servants out to accost the woman, the second of which servants put spurs to his horse, but the more he spurred the horse, the further she would be from him. The chase is repeated the next day with identical results. On the third day, Poole himself takes up the futile chase, until, in exasperation, he calls out to her, Maiden, for the sake of the man you love most, wait for me. I will gladly, she said, and it had been better for the horse if you had asked it long ago. A certain amount of dry humor in this, also not so dry. She then acknowledges that she has come specifically to see Poole and identifies herself as Rianna, daughter of Havaidhain, and asserts that she is being married against her will to another man, but that she loves only Poole. This introduction of Rianna puts the audience immediately in the legendary past world of early British, and I will assert later, common Celtic culture. First, in a story in which the question of fitness for sovereignty has already been raised, Rhiannon fits into the established thematic narrative slot of the sovereignty goddess of the locality, who must be symbolically wed to the head of the tribe. The Enail dynastic origin story, The Five Sons of Yaki Moivain, explains how the youngest son, Neil, because of his willingness to sleep with the loathly lady, which his older brothers have been unwilling to do, gains the sovereignty that she has to offer. Likewise, the royal inauguration story related by Gerald of Wales in the 12th century in his Itinerary of Ireland, which also, by the way, clearly involves some northern Enail group who are characterized, among other things, by lots of personal names involving the word horse. There are lots of people named Yachi and like in that particular family. And of course, he tells with alleged horror the somewhat pornographic story of the horrifying inaugural rite in which the king mates with a mare, and then they chop her up and make soup out of her, and he gets into the soup and drinks the soup, and then he gives his clothes to the next guy in line, and so on and so forth. And of course, for many, many years in the 19th and 20th century, this was viewed as a horrible slander against the Irish, but it's unquestionably of Indo-European antiquity. It has a very close parallel in Sanskrit, the Ahasvamedha, the great horse ceremony. And furthermore, Gerald couldn't have made this up. And it's so appropriate for the Northern Enail. However, it's a little bit like stories about cannibals. It's always the guys across the river. You know, I don't think he heard this from the principals. I think he heard this from the guys across the river and said, do you know what they used to do up there? But nevertheless, I think that this is relating something that was at least remembered as a ritual. So owing to her magical horse, so I think that involves this horsely sovereignty goddess, Rhiannon has often been equated with a well-known Gaulish deity, Epona, whose name means Ms-equine animal. There she is. This is from Champoulet, which is slightly southwest of Paris, probably from the 1st century. Rhiannon's equine connections are emphasized in her later unjust punishment in the Mabinogi for allegedly killing her infant son. She participates in the calumniated wife pattern in which she gives birth. The child disappears magically, but the servants, afraid of being blamed themselves, say that she killed the child and ate it, whatever. And so Poole is distressed by this report, and without having a trial, he punishes her, and her punishment is to carry visitors on her back to the court. She waits by the front of the court, and when visitors come, she carries them on her back. Later on, Manawyddan, she is magically confined by wearing a horse collar. That is her form of confinement during her magical disappearance into the other world. Additionally, her son Guri, later renamed Pryderi, has a congenital horse, which he begins to care for when he is a small boy. Her appropriateness as a sovereignty goddess is apparent both in her name, Rhiannon, which is pretty transparently, I think, from unattested Rigantona, great queen, or possessor of queenliness, to which we could compare as a lexical item the name of the Irish battle goddess, Morrigan, which perhaps is from Mor plus Regan, although that's a less clear etymology, meaning great queen or big queen. And in her demand to marry Poole rather than the husband chosen for her, that is, the sovereignty goddess gets to choose who she's going to sleep with. Her father, whoever he is, doesn't get to choose. We'll get to him in a minute. Rhiannon's status as a goddess of horses, as well as of sovereignty, seems metaphorically, historically appropriate for a semi-nomadic tribal people who defined their polity by lineage rather than by geography. It is notable that until the end of the Middle Irish period, most Irish tribal names were fully declinable names of peoples rather than of territories. For example, the first line of the 9th century story Scéal Muki Macdatho, the story of Macdatho's pig, is Boi ri avra for Logniv, Edon Macdatho Aniv. There was a famous king over the Leinstermen, Logniv, dative plural, namely Macdatho. In such a social context, the mythic mating of the incoming royal lineage and the stationary goddess of the place is a perfect metaphor. These mythic and legendary motifs seem particularly appropriate in the setting of Poole, which is a sort of royal Bildungsroman in which Poole, who starts with the title Pendevig Dyfed, the chieftain or prince of Dyfed, actually earns the title while learning the necessary steps to become a proper sovereign. He learns from his mistakes. First, by insulting the king of the other world, Araun, and atoning by successfully fulfilling the role of king of the other world in Araun's place. And, of course, he gets the later title, Poole, head of Anuvan, so he's the king of the honorary king of the underworld. Second, by learning to ask the sovereignty goddess politely, rather than just chasing her down. Third, by listening to the advice of Rhiannon, when she becomes his fiancée, after he has interrupted what were to be his own nuptials, by offering a rather dumb, rash boon. And having written that sentence, I put in parentheses, are there smart rash boons? To Rhiannon's previous betrothed, Gwawl. And fourth, by ultimately acknowledging his too easy acceptance of Rhiannon's apparent guilt in the disappearance, the alleged murder of their son, and then by appointing proper foster parents for the boy after his rediscovery. Myth and legend do not survive unless they continue somehow to serve some audience, and on the level of what we might call authorizing metaphor, the tale of Poole and Rhiannon can be seen to have relevance in the 12th and 13th century, in 12th and 13th century Wales. The Edwardian Reconquista of the 13th century had left the native Welsh nobility scattered and demoralized, and narratives emphasizing native conceptions of sovereignty and legitimacy would have had a certain appeal to a Welsh-speaking audience. Thus, metaphoric aptness is an element of stickiness in this case, and cases like it. Historically illustrative and or metaphoric stories and story patterns connected to pre-Christian deities and otherworld figures find continuing use because they provide orderliness to the imagining of the relationship of the past to the present. The ultimate appeal in Roman argumentation, after all, was to the mos maiorum, the custom of our ancestors. That was sort of the Roman equivalent of "I'm your mother," and you've actually lost the argument. You appeal to the mos maiorum. But wait, there's more. There is also a geographic aspect to the tale of Poole and Rianna. To begin with, Poole is lord over the 7 contraves of Dyfed. Poole Pendevig Dyfed, a Oed and Arglwydd, our 8th contrave Dyfed. Emlyn, Cemais, Gwarthav, Penfro, Daegleddyf, Pebidiog, and Hros. Actually, there's a death right here, I think. Yes, good. Okay, so we have Emlyn, Cemais, Gwarthav, Penfro, where's Penfro's down there, Daegleddyf, which is in here, Pebediog, which is where, I'm not seeing it, there it is, out on the peninsula, and Hros. Rhiannon identifies herself as the daughter of Havaith Hain, Havaith the Old, or better, the lineage founding ancestor, as Patrick Ford has argued. That is, Patrick Ford argued many years ago that these guys with the title Hain are, in fact, marked as lineage starting figures. And we find this in Irish, too, with guys who are called Moor. And sometimes, in the later period, they sort of take on the title in hopes of being in a new nexus in the lineage. But I think this Pat first noticed that Noah is in the translation of the Bible is called Noah Hain, and of course he would be the ultimate ancestor of everybody. And anyway, he makes a very good case for this, and I think that's what Havaith is here. He's the head of some lineage which Rhiannon belongs to. Now, there was a historical Havaith, son of Blethery, who ruled Dyfed in the 9th century. According to Triads 68, he was one of the 3 kings sprung from peasant stock. I would not argue that Rhiannon's father is necessarily meant to be that Havaith, because that would really mess up some of the pseudo-chronology. But the association of the name with the kingdom of Dyfed is, I think, the point here. The name of her father links her to the land of Dyfed, underlining her role as its sovereignty goddess. Her otherworldly suitor, Gwawl ap Clyd, Wall, son of the River Clyde, or maybe Illumination, son of the River Clyde, is presumably from farther north. He might represent a long-lasting literary trace of the British kingdom of Strathclyde, or an atavistic name amongst the Guri Gogledd, the men of the north, Cynedda and his descendants, who dominated the rule of Gwynedd and thus much of Wales after migrating from Strathclyde and Hreged during the Middle Ages. My own guess is that the name is a learned joke of something, what's the most northerly name you could have? Hadrian's Wall, son of the River Clyde. But who knows? And of course, he's subject to the humiliation of Badger in the Bag, this mysterious game in which he's put into a bag and kicked around, and so on and so forth. And of course, as a thematic matter, the bags come up later as being full of soldiers who are killed by Efnisien and then rejuvenated in the cauldron of rebirth in the battle in Ireland. So there's something about bags going on here which I don't understand, but it's going on. And the first branch ends in this way. Years and years passed, until Poole Pen Anuvin's life ended and he died. And then Pryderi, his son, ruled the 7 cantrefs of Dyfed successfully. Later, he gained the 3 cantrefs of Ystrad Toe, Contraf Mawr, Contraf Buchan, and Kidwelly. So we have this. Great. Can I, let's see what happens if I do. Right, there we go. Okay, so we have Contra of Maur, Contra of Buchan, and what's the third one? And Cadwelly. So, where are you, Cadwelly? Oh, right there. Okay. Yeah. Okay, so that consolidates the lower part here, you see. This is a different Contra of Maur. And also the four cantrefs of Ceredigion. Is-Eiron, Uch-Eiron, Bwelt, and Penwethig. Okay, so now we have this whole area consolidated, and this is virtually as big as Gwynedd. And we have to add to that, and it says, these are called the seven cantrefs of Saisilluch, which of course was briefly a medieval kingdom. We can add to this list Gwent Iscoed down here, because that's where Pryderi's foster father, Ternion, is from. So there's something going on here about territorial claims in the south. A look at the map will illustrate the territorial claims in South Wales that are attached to Rhiannon, Poole, and Pryderi. If, as has been conjectured, one of the motives for Iolo Morgannwg's 18th century forgeries of medieval Welsh materials was his desire to provide a legendary and literary history for Glamorganshire, the medieval Glywysing, which had left practically no written remains, perhaps in Poole we see a similar attempt to shore up the credentials of South Wales by providing useful origin stories. I think that Rhiannon's connection to the geography of South Wales is another part of her stickiness. The alleged accumulation of historical territories would fall under a second element of stickiness to go with orderliness, and that is origins. Where does authority come from? Well, in this culture, not in our culture, but in their culture, it comes from ancestry. In fact, our culture has given up the whole notion of ancestry, particularly as one of my colleagues said that it was from Chicago, said that the tradition of California was the tradition of the future. The things that Californians, thought of as characterizing themselves and so on and so forth was that they were going somewhere good. That something good was going to happen next. And they didn't think it was going to be drought and mudslides and what have you. But it's an interesting element. I mean, if you look at the complete collapse of in Western society, certainly in Anglophone society, of kinship terms. We're practically down to having eliminated cousins, except for first cousins that you keep up with, which is a very interesting, this tendency to atomize ourselves has gotten quite pronounced in this culture. Well, these people thought about it quite differently. So origins matter. It comes from ancestry, from knowing the deeds of your own forebears as well as your own. Aristotle said that the polis was not the physical fabric of the city-state or its geographical boundaries, but rather the citizens, plural, shared story of the history of the polis. Virgil provided the Julian rulers of Rome with an origin story in the Aeneid. And closer to home, Geoffrey of Monmouth provided a similar origin story for the sovereignty of Britain, the Britain ruled by the newly implanted Plantagenets. We see a similar attention to origins and orderliness in the medieval Irish material. The Ulster Cycle tales are set in the pseudo-historical pentarchy of the pseudo-historical year 1, or thereabouts. And that pseudo-historical date is, of course, pinpointed by at least one thread of pseudo-history in Ireland by the fact that the death of King Conchobar of Ulster is promoted by, he has a brain ball in his head, so he really shouldn't be king anymore anyway, but he is, and he's at Evan Macha, and the word comes to him of the crucifixion. and he becomes so irate at the crucifixion that the brain ball pops out of his head and he dies. Well, that fixes the death of Conqueror at 33. And so everything in the Ulster cycle that happens before that. It's not that there aren't other competing chronologies you can make out of the Ulster cycle material, but I think that one places it pretty much around the year 1, and I think that's where these guys wanted it to be. The very setting of the notion of 5 provinces with a central point is itself almost certainly pan-Celtic and possibly pan-Indo-European. Caesar says that the Gaulish Druids met each year in the territory of the Carnutes, and today I would bet my house they met on the site of the cathedral at Chartres, which Caesar says they considered to be the center of Gaul. The Hill of Ushneck fills a similar purpose in Ireland, and is traditionally regarded as the center of the country. The place name Milan, from Mediolanum, middle place, may be a remnant of a similar place designation. And of course the Omphalos at Delphi, which I don't have a picture of, but it looks like the Turo stone. It's one of these little sort of rounded short phallic stones with decorations around it. In fact, rather creepily reminiscent of the Turo stone, or the Turo stone is creepily reminiscent of it. Rees and Rees make the case that the arrangement of the world into 5 zones, 4 peripheral and 1 central, is a fundamental Indo-European schema. As such, its continuation into later legend is both an element of stickiness and an example of why it is sticky. It organizes the matrix of the world and can be put to use as an origin legend. That is, that wherever you are in the world, the fundamental organization is for peripheral things and a central thing. Interestingly, of course, there are competing notions of what the 5 parts of the Pentarchy were in Irish pseudo-history. One is Ulster, Leinster, Munster, Connaught, which of course would be anachronistically named, since Con the Hundred Fighter didn't live until a couple hundred years afterwards, and so his sons couldn't have named the thing then. And of course, in the earlier texts of the Táin Bó Cúailnge, it's called Old Neckmach, beyond the fastness. It's whatever's beyond the River Shannon. So that's so one construction is the 4 provinces with Meath in the middle, aptly named Meath, where the Hill of Ushneck is. However, there's a competing version, which also has some philological support, that the 5 provinces are Connaught, or Old Neckmach, whatever we want to call it, Ulster, Leinster, South Munster, and North Munster. And of course, the names for North Munster and South Munster persist in Irish and in English. Hence we have Thomond. And Desmond, North Munster and South Munster. So Meath, of course, survives as a middle name. And of course, the Hill of Ushneck is in Meath. But as historically, in actual history, as the base of a powerful tribal confederation, Meath doesn't arise until very late in the game. So it's clearly, Meath is clearly not part of any actual political geographical organization in early medieval times, but it clearly is part of a conceptual scheme, which I would guess the Celts and perhaps, as Rees and Rees suggest, other Indo-Europeans took with them wherever they went. The introduction of Christianity and writing, and as a result the entire ancient biblical history of the world, that is when in the 5th century the Irish become Christian, and then perforce become aware of what Christians know, which is not only the Old and New Testament, but includes Roman history, Greek history, Roman mythology, Greek mythology, all sorts of historical material. They'd learn the dates of the Olympic Games, which handily go just about back to the foundation of Rome toward the beginning of the 5th century BC. So there's some handy things about this. And suddenly they have to integrate all this stuff. They've got their own system. They know exactly how they got to where they are. And now suddenly they've got this whole new system that they've got to integrate with it. So the traditional world of the native gods continues to provide a stable base, a local origin story, and an authenticating set of narratives that distinguish their own local history from that of the rest of the Christian world. Characters such as Lug MacEthlin, Fergus MacRoig are pretty straightforwardly gods. Cuchulainn, Conchobar, Ailill, Conall Cernach, and other heroes, like Poole and Pryderi, seem to be seriously intermixed with gods of the other world, either by maternity or paternity, Cuchulainn or Pryderi, by exploits or attributes, Poole, who substitutes for the king of the other world, or Fergus, who is both Cuchulainn's foster father and an exemplar of druidic knowledge and practice when he decodes Ogham and the like, although, of course, the people who were passing on our versions of things like the Táin Bó Cúailnge had no idea that Fergus is a druid, although, well, they use the word druid quite freely, but it's pretty clear they're just translating it from Latin magus, so they knew there were such people, but they really didn't know what they did. And some of them are distinguished by special names. Conchobar, Ailill, and Lug, at a minimum, have matronymics rather than patronymics, and I don't think the import of this is as Ternisen and people of that generation thought of as a previous condition of mutterect. I don't think there was a period of Celtic or Indo-European maternal descent. I think that having a matronym indicates something else entirely, and that it has something to do with connection with the gods. My late Berkeley colleague, Bill Bascom, famously proposed a structural distinction between myth and legend, myths being narratives that take place in the time before the creation of the ordinary world of history, while legends are narratives set in the present world, even if they involve supernatural beings or elements. Thus, by his definition, the book of Genesis is myth, while the rest of the Old and New Testament is legend, because it takes place in the world in which we live. Hesiod's Theogony is a myth, while the Homeric epics are legend. Leaving aside the casual use of the word myth to mean something stupid you believe that I do not, calling to mind Bishop Warburton's quip to the 4th Earl of Sandwich, orthodoxy is my doxy, heterodoxy is another man's doxy, there are, of course, many other ways to look at the terms myth and mythology. An important definition is a functional one. A myth is a narrative on which some people feel or once felt compelled to model or modify their behavior. By this definition, the entire Bible constitutes myth, as does, say, the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran. And I'll be using or alluding to both those definitions, that is, both the functional one and the time-centered or era-centered one. When we speak of myth and legend, even when the narratives in question have many living believers, we are almost always speaking of a reception phenomenon, since most narratives achieve mythic or legendary status only with the passage of time. That is, what makes a myth or a narrative powerful is that people continue to use it, pass it on, modify it, deal with it. So really what we know about it is not so much from whoever made it up, so to speak, wherever it came from, whether the mouth of God or whatever. What we can see is how people react to it, what people do with it. And so really we're looking at reception. And of course reception is important. We often talk about genre, but when you start to push genre to the limits, you find out that it kind of doesn't exist, because there's no pure example of any genre. There's no member of any genre that fulfills completely and only all of the requirements of the genre. So once again, it's a way of recognizing things, whether recognizing clusters of things rather than something native to the thing itself. Even in the case of recently developed mythologies, we seldom have direct access to their creators. Well, and as a professor of rhetoric, I can tell you that the authors have no special interpretational privilege anyway. If I don't know if any, there used to be a paperback edition of Death of a Salesman with a preface by Arthur Miller. If the play was as shallow as he apparently thinks it is, no one would ever produce it. If a student had given me that as an essay, I would have given him a C- and said, watch this play again. There's a lot more going on there than you've noticed. So, it's just not the way artists work. I go, oh, that looks good. I'm still keeping that. Why? I don't know. Anyway, even in the case of recently developed mythologies, we seldom have direct access to their creators. The Baha'u'llah, Joseph Smith, and even L. Ron Hubbard are unavailable for interview. And I've tried calling Mary Baker Eddy's phone, but she doesn't answer. She famously has a phone in her mausoleum in Boston. I don't know what the number is, but of course, if you called it and somebody picked up, I'd have a heart attack. In the case of the medieval Celtic world, as with the medieval Germanic world, and no doubt many others, we have a case of at least double reception. First, a fully comprehensive set of pre-Christian origin stories, now, alas, surviving mainly in fragments and references, and second, the competing set of mythical, legendary, pseudo-historical, and historical beliefs ushered in by Christianity. An excellent example of this process and of the interpenetration of Irish and British learned lore occurs at the end of the second branch of the Mabinogi, Bronwyn, daughter of Llŷr. After Bronn and his followers have defeated the Irish, avenged the treatment of Bronwyn by Matholwch, and returned to Wales, the text reports, in Ireland none were left alive except 5 pregnant women in a cave in the wastes of Ireland. And these 5 women simultaneously bore 5 sons. They raised these 5 boys until they were big lads, who turned their thoughts on women and desired to have them. And then they slept in turn with each other's mother, and they inhabited the land and dwelt in it, dividing it among the 5 of them. They still call the 5 districts from that division. This passage is taken directly from the massive and unfinished medieval Irish pseudo-historical work called the Leabhar Gabála, the Book of Invasions. It's really the book of the taking of sovereignty, I think. Gavad is the verb that you use in Chronicles and in genealogies, and when it says, and then so-and-so took the sovereignty. And it doesn't necessarily mean by force, but somehow the metaphor is that sovereignty has to be taken by you. And of course, in the Icelandic has a similar sort of conception, and the Landnama book, the book of the land taking of Iceland, although that may be pretty historical, actually. So this passage is part of an attempt to reconcile native Irish lore with the biblical story of the flood. That's what it's doing as part of the big project. That is, the Irish are suddenly confronted with the fact that they must have been subject to the flood, so they had to figure out who they were descended from, which was Japheth, like the rest of the Europeans. But then they had this weird story of Partalon and what have you, and this is how Ireland was repopulated after the flood, these 5 pregnant women. But what we find in Bronwyn is an appropriation of the story not to explain how Ireland was repopulated after Noah's flood, which Bronwyn doesn't have any interest in as a story, but that the war between Bran and Matholwch was the origin of the Pentarchy. Okay, so this is readjusting the relationship between the Island of the Mighty and Ireland. As such, like the Ulster Cycle narratives, the stories and characters of the Mabinogi collection take place just at the interface between mythic and legendary time, in Bascom's terms. Characters like Bran, Rhiannon, Manawyddan, and the other children of Llŷr, Mabon, Cuchulainn, Fergus MacRoig, Conchobar MacNessa, and Ailill MacMata are, one might say, either last-generation gods or first-generation humans. It may be notable in this regard that characters from this pseudo-historical stratum, such as Conchobar and Ailill, have, as I have mentioned, matronymics rather than patronymics. This particular intersection brings up a third feature of stickiness with respect to pre-Christian worldview, and that is ostentation. So we have orderliness, origins, and ostentation. So we have presenting you with a mnemonic. You can take or leave. If I'm right about the first three branches of the Mabinogi being concerned with asserting pseudo-historical claims about the sovereignty of Siselug, we can see the same phenomenon in the reception of the Ulster cycle. The original Ulid, the tribe of the Ulid, probably the Uluti of Ptolemy's 2nd century map of Ireland, who are up in northeast Ireland, were the tribe called the Dalfiadoc. That is, that the Dalfiadoc were the original Ulid. But by the 7th century, the ethnonym had been claimed by the resurgent Dalnarda, who, by the time our versions, the Táin, are being written down, have been claiming for some time that this is about them. Donohoe Corrine's recent paper at the 15th International Celtic Congress at the University of Glasgow argued cogently that some of the Irish genealogies contained material dating back to the time of Ptolemy's map, which would mean that they were preserving material that had been in oral form for 300 years at a minimum before Christianity brought writing to Ireland, and they're remarkably accurate. That is, that they know things about 2nd century tribal movements and characters that mean that they got this information somewhere during the classical period. And because I think these are mainly southern genealogies, the Enail didn't bother to strike them out at some point. I have called the medieval Irish intellectuals' attempt to reconcile the new facts brought in with Christianity with their own highly developed and presumably coherent native lore the big project, and it clearly occupied the efforts of countless medieval Irishmen, and perhaps some Irish women, from around AD 550 through the 15th century. Similar efforts may have been undertaken in Britain, but we have even less direct evidence from the Big Island than we do from Ireland. And we have rather different, we have the same kinds of non-comprehensive material. We have triads, we have place name studies, we have things like the stanzas of the graves, we have things like the Gododin, which of course we want to make into an epic about the battle, but which, when you look at it closely, looks like another stanzas of the graves. It looks pretty much like a compilation of commemorative death songs, but I've written about that too, that our desire to find things often produces them. The process of assimilating the old mythology to the new is exemplified by the material in the Irish law tracts, which, when written down in the 7th century, consciously incorporated much material from the Old Testament as evidence of the righteousness of their ancestors. And like the Anglo-Saxons, the newly Christianized Irish tended to see their own history as exactly parallel to the Hebrews of the Old Testament. And in fact, in Anglo-Saxon England, there was even a controversy about whether whales were kosher. I can't remember what the verdict was on that. I don't think they stopped eating whale. For example, the tracts on marriage justify parallel cousin marriage between rich women and poorer men of their same kindred by explicit reference to the story of the daughters of Salphad and Leviticus, which Donohoe Corrine has written about. The early 9th century retrospective pseudo preface to the major 7th century Irish law tract, the Seneca Mar, the Great Lore, provides both an example of this process of reception, incorporation, and an explanation of the process itself in the law tracts. And this is a pseudo-historical preface from the 9th century explaining how the book got written. For the Holy Spirit spoke, and and of course by this time they have to get Patrick into the deal, because the Enail are already in business. For the Holy Spirit spoke and prophesied through the mouths of the righteous men who were the first in the island of Ireland, as he prophesied through the mouths of the chief prophets and patriarchs in the law of the Old Testament. So there's explicit parallelism between the prophets of the seers of ancient Ireland and the prophets of the Old Testament. For the law of nature reached many things which the law of Scripture did not. As for the judgments of true nature, which the Holy Spirit uttered through the mouths of the righteous judges and poets of the men of Ireland, from the time when this island was settled until the coming of the faith, Duvtak revealed them all to Patrick. Whatever did not go against God's word in the law of Scripture and in the New Testament, or against the consciences of the faithful, was fixed in the system of judgment by Patrick and the churches and the princes of Ireland severally. The law of nature was acceptable, save in what concerns the faith and its proper dues, and the knitting together of church and kingdom. So that is the Seneca Mar. And that translation is from John Carey's recent edition of this rather interesting piece. While anachronistic in its own time, this passage probably correctly iterates the actual process of accommodating native material to Christian and other European and Mediterranean history and culture. Unlike the exceptionally meager Welsh prose tradition, Irish has a mythological cycle. And actually, it just occurred to me I should throw in here that one of the things that happens in this process of accommodation is that some things get partially exempted from it. There are practically no classical references, and I happen not to believe in the alleged reference to electo in the Táin. I think that the phrase means, which is not capitalized, means to the flagstones. It's a place name. But otherwise, the number of Latin loanwords in the Ulster cycle is remarkably small compared to other contemporary Irish prose. And secondly, there's a bunch of lexical items in diction, like Bertagadir, which, for instance, are part of diction which is really confined to the Ulster cycle. You don't find it in other contemporary stuff or in the Finn material. So one of the things they do is I think they are compartmentalizing some of this stuff as being in ways exempt from this other stuff they know is going on, stuff they don't have to accommodate to that, except in terms of chronology. So anyway, you can have that for free. So unlike the exceptionally meager Welsh prose tradition, Irish has a mythological cycle dealing with acknowledged pre-Christian gods such as Nuadu, Lug, and Balor, not to mention the Dagda. Our primary surviving document is the Second Battle of Moitra, on which we have the world expert sitting in the second row. A kind of war of the Aesir and Vanir, in which the Fomorian Bress, having become king over the Tuatha De Danann, has a disaster, having displaced Nuadu, has a disastrous reign characterized by drought and famine. Nuadu of the Silver Arm, the former king, who had his arm cut off and replaced by an even better silver one, is, and of course shows up in Welsh likewise, is killed in a battle with the one-eyed giant Balor during a revolt against Bress. But Lug defeats Balor and Bress is taken prisoner. But here's the interesting part. The terms for ransoming Bress are that he revealed the secrets of agriculture, when to sow, when to reap, what phases the moon do, and so on and so forth. Why should a king who has presided over drought and famine be expected to give up the secrets of agriculture? If he had them, he should have used them when he was king. Now, there's a Dumézilian answer to this, which I, in fact, like, which is that Bress was trying to fulfill the wrong function as king. He's a third function. If he's an expert in agriculture, he's properly a third function figure, and serving as a first function figure as a king would cause retribution from the land and thus famine. And by the way, you can also, as Emily might suggest, you can plot this onto an age structure as well. You could make Balor being too young to be king and so on and so forth. That these openly mythological tales should continue to exist in medieval Ireland is interesting in itself. But more interesting is that they form a background to the pseudo-historical stage of the Ulster cycle, in which the motif of the substitute king who becomes permanent, Conchover for Fergus equals Bress for the damaged Nuadu. The hero Cuchulainn, given the name Shadenda, the one connected with roots, shares the supernatural attributes of his real father Lug, a god of roots and roads, the equivalent of Mercury according to Caesar. The recapitulation of actual mythological narrative is a characteristic of medieval Welsh, Irish as well as of Welsh. Nuadu himself had an interesting mythological afterlife. As a god, he lost his arm, like the Norse god Tyr, and if Dumézil is correct in identifying Gaius Musius Scaevola with the Roman Dies Fidius as well, the Roman god of contracts. Gaius Musius Scaevola, of course, lost his arm when the Etruscan king says, "We have our methods of making you talk," he puts his hand in the brazier and lets it burn up. And then the king says, "I guess we're not going to get you to talk by torturing you." And then Livy dryly says afterwards that ever after he was called Scaevola, which means lefty. And of course, Tyr put his hand in the Fenris wolf's mouth when they tied him up in the game of hide and seek, and he said, "You're not going to let me go." And said, "Well, look, Tyr, he's the god of contract. He'll put his hand in your mouth, and then that'll be here." So then, as soon as they tied him up, they said, "Ha ha, we're not going to let you go." And he bit off Tyr's arm, and as the edit says, everyone laughed except Tyr. Anyway. So we have this god who loses his hand, but had it replaced by a better one in silver. He's equivalent to the Romano-British Nodens, whose Temple of Healing at Lydney Park in Gloucestershire was excavated by a team including J.R.R. Tolkien back in the 20s or 30s. And he ends up as a Breton saint. And there he is. This is in the crypt at a nice little town on the north coast of Brittany called Lanmeur. I don't know who Saint Meur was, but the church is dedicated to Saint Melar. And there are many representations of Melar, who, of course, is holding his arm in his arm. His wicked uncle wounded and deposed him from the kingship, but his arm was miraculously replaced by God. He's also, interestingly, connected to, as I say, this is in the crypt of the Church of St. Melar, and that's that statue back there. You're not going to see that. Back there, that's that same statue. But you notice here the snakes and stuff, and there's a well out of sight right here. So it's exactly like Nodens. This is a chthonic healing place, and naturally it's healing because he lost his arm and put it back on. But the story is identical to the story of Nuadu Argidlov. So just an odd washes up. And I found this. I discovered him quite by accident. When I was a graduate student, I was in Brittany for a while, and I had a little gîte rural just outside Lanmeur, and I went into town and I went to the church, and lo and behold, here is Nuadu in front of me. I mean, it's a very cool moment for me, I think. So there are three fundamental literary critical questions that need to be asked of any text. One, what is going on? Two, why does it matter to its original audience? And three, why should we care? What is going on in these medieval Celtic tales is both simple and complicated. The storylines are relatively simple, if bizarre in the case of the Four Branches, but individual incidents are from a variety of genres and sources. Indo-European epic patterns in the Táin Bó Cúailnge, which is basically the Iliad from the Trojan point of view. International folktale in the case of the Plague of Enchanted Mice. Native onomastics in the case of the Welsh Talabolion, which of course just means the end of the ridges, but in Bronwyn is because they're driving horses out there, calls it the counting of the horses. It's Talabolion, you see the counting of the ponies. Or the Irish Shlecta, which unambiguously means the hewn place, the place that was cut down, but within the text of the book of the Dun Cow version of the Táin has two competing onomastic stories as to why the place is called Shlecta. Manawyddan, as one of the three noble shoemakers, the striking of Branwen, one of the three most grievous blows, are triads, which occur both in Irish and Welsh. The Welsh ones the Welsh ones have been done more and are more interesting because, of course, we have the fabulous edition done by Mrs. Bromwich. But the Irish ones are very stripped down. They just tend to be the names. They don't have the stories attached to them. But they're clearly the same kind of mnemonic device. And a lot of what we have surviving here in this native material is mnemonic devices from formal oral poets and genealogers and judicial figures and so on and so forth, this whole sort of Brahmin or Druid class who was responsible for all this learned stuff. And these are their indices, if you will. The Van Henicus, which tells you what tribes married into their women into what other tribes in a systematic way. The Din Henicus, which tells us how places got their names, which is often connected to things that happened there or who owned them and so on and so forth. And the genealogical material, which John Kelleher has said are constitutional documents. and have to be constantly readjusted to get to the present state of affairs. Brian Boru, whose family was probably originally Deshi, but by that time, by his day, the Deshi had become extremely down market. Nobody wanted to admit to being Deshi, so he has his genealogists cook up a descent from the Oanakta, the ancient rulers of Cashel, which is pretty dubious. So we have and of course we have the Triads. We have genealogy, or at least pseudo-genealogy, of Aidhain, Conchobar McNess, the son of Cathbad, the Druid. One of the things that's going on in the Mabinogi is an attempt to establish a coherent picture of the earliest stages of civil polity in southwest Wales. It must be the earliest stages because it involves interactions between humans and pre-Christian deities. That is, that the very intrusion of these god figures is validation of the foundational nature of these stories. Either you are in the realm of pure mythology, such as in the first and second battles of Moitra, or later you are in the realm of the ordinary. These tales are set in an important liminal period, and I would argue, pseudo-historical liminal period, and I would argue that it is one of the reasons that the tales were important to their own original audience. While not directly ancestral to later medieval people, the existence of this period, that is, while the characters are not directly ancestral, people are not claiming descent from Conchobar or from Cuchulainn, although they do from Conall Cernach, who is built up as the ancestor of several of the major Leinster lineages. And of course, he's been identified as Cernunnos, the god with the horns and whatever. The existence of this period anchors later genealogical material on the secular side. I was informed yesterday that Llewellyn ap Griffith actually wrote a letter to Henry III claiming that Wales was independent because he, Llewellyn, was directly descended from Camber, the son of Geoffrey of Monmouth's Brutus of Troy, whose portion was Wales. And of course, Locrinem was over England and Albanius over Scotland, etymologically, interestingly. And but once again, this founding person with the three sons, for those of you who heard my talk about Macbeth and the sons of Urk, the descendants of Urk, who of course become the Dalrida major Dalrida lineages, or the sons of Mill, who interestingly have to have a fourth son tacked on later in the Seneca Shil when politics shifts badly in Northern Ireland. But it's an interesting sort of pattern that we see replicated as late as the 12th century here. So in the 13th century, the political usefulness of pseudo-historical genealogy is clear. So the original cultures did care about these materials and seemingly had good reason to do so. They provided origins, orderliness, and ostentation. These are largely narratives of a particular pseudo-historical time, when the gods intermingled with ordinary men, and as such could offer a kind of grounded shared worldview regarding pre-Christian or non-Christian or a-Christian times in vernacular history. As to why we should care, I can only offer the notion that we too have been partially made who we are culturally by these same fictions. We still throw precious metal into water. This is a pool at the Luxor Casino in Las Vegas. I was coming down an escalator and could not resist taking this picture. And now, granted, you want to have luck when you're there, but there's no sign saying there's a titular deity who's going to help you with luck here. It's a decorative feature with pseudo-Egyptian crap around it. And I love the Luxor. They give me good deals. So we still throw precious metals into water, but only places with a Celtic cultural substrate or with Celtic immigrants do this. Central African people do not throw stuff into water in malls. We do. Chinese people don't do this. Why? This is this atavistic Celtic longing for dispensation from the female sources of water. And there are, of course, some other recognizable forms of stickiness. Nuadu Argadlav, or Nothens, is eventually transmogrified into Saint Melar, who holds his unrestored hand in its replacement, echoing his mythological ancestor and his association with healing chthonic powers. The Trinox Samon Sindiu of the first century calendar of Coligny, and that's up in the corner here. This is the second day of the second half of the month of Simonios, Trinox Samon. This is the three nights of Samhain begin today. And if you normalize the Colloquium calendar to the Gregorian calendar, this is the 1st of November. And of course, we know it becomes Samhain in Ireland, and we know in the Táin Bó Cúailnge that the attack occurred after the 3 days of Samhain. That's when they set out. Some of this stuff is very deep and very sticky. In his Wahrheit und Methode, Hans-Georg Gadamer stresses the importance of tradition. He claims, following Heidegger, that a fundamental unity exists between thought, I would say, among thought, language, and the world. It is through language that the horizon of the now comes into being. This language, however, is always marked by the past. Through language, the past lives on in the present and thus represents tradition. According to Gadamer, the Enlightenment made an important mistake when it failed to take these prejudices and traditions seriously. The burden of the past was too easily discarded. Gadamer claims that it is tradition which shapes our ways of understanding and interpreting the world through language. And this tradition, he is well aware, does not exist of itself. It must constantly be embraced, confirmed, and cultivated, and that's what brings us to reception. It also requires, although Gadamer doesn't tell us this, reinterpretation and imagination. I have elsewhere characterized this kind of traditional stickiness as cultural intention, a term I invented in the 1970s, which is caught on nowhere, which often overrides the personal intentions of the carrier of the narrative. You see this in Homer all the time. He tells you something's going to happen, and then something else happens. This is not just a blind motif. This is Homer being forced by the traditional structure of the story, to violate his own expectations that he has set up for the audience. Not all traditions seem to have the particular kind of stickiness we see in Irish and Welsh medieval material. Outside of Eddic poetry and Snorri Sturluson's highly synthetic 14th century Heimskringla, Old Norse does not seem to have the same kind of survival of the gods. Hesiod and Homer represent a similar kind of tradition, which survives in the classical world for many of the same reasons, I think, providing a set of foundational narratives that continue to make sense of the fundamental structure of these cultures. The continuation of classical mythology by figures like Ovid and Virgil gives evidence of the cultural validity of these ancient stories. There is a particular reason, though, why we find the particular kind of stickiness in medieval Celtic narrative. I blame it on the Druids. Perhaps because Christianity came late to Ireland and parts of Britain, its learned class, which, like the Brahmin caste in India, was responsible for history, religion, astronomy, and the other learned arts, remained fully functioning and in control of their native material until the early Middle Ages, and even continued in traditional pre-Christian professions within official Christianity. I often say to my student, the Druids just turned around the sign, and say, okay, priest here. And as you can see, that we know that many of the clerics involved in this are from old learned families. Our friend Maelmurra MacKellar McQuinn Namach, the main hand of the Elu Táin, comes from a family of County Louth tribal historians. These people, before they were Christians, were undoubtedly doing exactly the same thing. With the coming of Christianity, this class did not go away, as is evidenced by the genealogies, law tracts, king list, Inhenicus, Banhenicus, triads, and narratives. Much of the material produced orally enters the written traditions of these cultures and preserves not only earlier details, but a general picture of the world. So long as that picture seems useful in the present, whatever present that is, it is retold. Thank you.